You can't turn on your TV or scan social media without stumbling across someone calling for Canada to become an energy superpower, which is great, except that the phrase is absolutely meaningless. No one has ever defined it. The only ones who ever use it are politicians, like former Prime Minister Stephen Harper and current Prime Minister Mark Carney, which means one thing: you're being manipulated, conditioned to accept a political deal that's already been negotiated behind closed doors. In this case, the construction of at least one new oil pipeline, but maybe more than one. So I'm planning 3 videos to unpack energy superpower. Number 1, Canada and the current energy landscape. Number 2, what the phrase energy superpower should mean. Number 3, the link between the current energy superpower hysteria and Alberta's even more hysterical demands for pipelines in all directions and the elimination of recent federal regulations that it doesn't like. If that isn't enough, I'm currently working with energy economist Dr. Chris Bataille on a 4th video that argues for a different, less risky pipeline strategy for Canada. We're a small country with vast natural resources. This chart shows where Canada ranks globally on the production of various sources of energy. Canada's ranking in the top 10 global producers of most forms of energy suggests it is a very substantial producer of energy, and much of that energy is exported, generating considerable revenue for the producers, royalties and taxes for government, jobs for workers, and business for suppliers. Oil and gas exports, for example, reached 188 billion Canadian in 2024. But does that make Canada an energy superpower? Well, no. Energy economist Chris Bataille defines an energy superpower as a country that produces enough of an energy commodity like oil or gas that it can influence both price and supply.
To my mind, an energy superpower is a country or a jurisdiction that can supply as much of they want to of some energy commodity at a price that's lower than the going price, right? So that they can keep increasing supply and putting it on global markets, and in that way they start to influence the global price. By pulling your supply from the market or adding it to the market, you have leverage. You set the global agenda. You have some say over what the price is. Like Saudi Arabia is very definitely a global superpower when it comes to crude oil because they're the swing producer. I'd argue the United States is a global superpower with LNG because they've been able to put so much on the market that they're influencing the global price, as is Qatar and a couple of other players.
By this definition, Canada is not an energy superpower, not even close. For most forms of energy, Canada is a big producer, but not big enough to exert the kind of power over markets that Chris Bataille talks about. Canada is a price taker, not a price maker. The only possible exception is heavy crude oil. Here, Canada is king, with about 1/3 of the global market, 60% of the market in the United States. Yet Canada still takes the price offered by the market. This is the main reason Alberta wanted a pipeline to the West Coast in the first place. Finally, with the completion of the Trans Mountain expansion last year, oil sands companies can sell into Asian markets where OPEC suppliers got $10 to $20 more for their barrels. No wonder Alberta and the oil sands producers want one or more new pipelines. Asia's emerging markets are the holy grail for the oil sands. Unfortunately, Canadian heavy crude oil is a marginal barrel for Asian refineries and petrochemical complexes. I'll be explaining this in more detail in a future video, but here are the basics. TMX pipeline tolls, plus dockage fees, plus marine transport costs add enough cost to Alberta heavy crude that competitors like Saudi Arabia and Iraq are the usual choice of Asian customers. Now, I hasten to add, not all the time. China and India are the biggest Asian buyers of heavy crude by far. Alberta heavy is rarely competitive in India, but it can compete under some circumstances in China. For example, the global heavy market has been tight recently, which is why we're beginning to see some oil sand shiploads sell to China. Know where Alberta heavy crude is hands down the lowest cost, most competitive barrel? The United States. The market Canada already dominates. The one US President Donald Trump is roiling with tariff threats. Canada, or more accurately, Alberta, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. A marginal barrel in the only growing markets on the planet, and the dominant barrel in now uncertain markets. So why are producers in Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith, willing to roll the dice on Asia? In a word, OPEC. The cartel led by Saudi Arabia also produces an annual report titled The World Oil Outlook. Last year's edition forecasts an increase in global oil consumption from the current 103 million barrels per day to 120 million barrels per day in 2050. OPEC thinks that 17 million barrels per day of new demand will all come from the global south, led by Asia. No wonder Smith has been loudly predicting that Alberta will double its oil production from 4 million to 8 million barrels per day. If that happened, Canada might at least become a heavy crude oil superpower. But the Achilles heel of Alberta's ambitions is the International Energy Agency. The IEA and many other reputable firms and agencies predict that global oil demand will peak in 2030, right around the time a new Canadian pipeline might come into operation. At Energy Media, we think the IEA's announced policy scenario, the APS scenario, where oil consumption falls to 57 million barrels per day by 2050, is most likely. Even if consumption only falls to 70 million or 80 million barrels per day, that's a major disruption to markets with much lower prices the likely result. So, where does this leave Canada? Well, not an energy superpower, not likely to become an energy superpower, and faced with two major risk factors: a marginally competitive barrel of heavy crude in Asia and looming peak oil demand that could permanently crash markets. Which is why all the talk of Canada being an energy superpower sounds like a smokescreen for a deal between Alberta and Ottawa. Maybe Alberta gets a pipeline to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, in exchange for supporting Carney's build, build, build economic plans. Maybe Ottawa makes concessions on greenhouse gas and environmental regulations in exchange for Smith's cooperation. Whatever the deal is, the energy superpower hype sends a pretty clear message to Canadian taxpayers to hold on to their wallets.